Farabi Innovations, Enterprise Transformation, Decoded.
This episode is sponsored by Brighter Talent Advisory, comprehensive retained executive search for IT and cybersecurity initiatives. Enjoy the podcast.
Welcome to another episode from Farabi Innovations, the podcast where we explore tech, strategy, and business transformation. Today, we're kicking off something special, our very first executive series episode, where we sit down with the visionaries, leaders, shaping industries, driving innovation, and redefining what's possible in the digital age. And to launch this series, we couldn't have asked for more of an exceptional guest. Joining us today is Stefan Househam, a true trailblazer in the world of technology and digital transformation. With a career spanning McKinsey, Deloitte, Diageo, and Estée Lauder companies, Stefan has led multi-million-dollar transformations, pioneered AI-driven value creation, and helped some of the world's biggest brands bridge the gap between strategy and execution. Today, we're diving deep into his journey and how he's unlocking business potential through AI, data, and cutting-edge tech, what it takes to drive change in global organizations, and his insights on the future of leadership in the digital era. So buckle up for a masterclass in innovation and transformation. Stefan, welcome to Farabi Innovations.
Thank you. Good to see you guys again.
Good to see you, Stefan.
So, Stefan, well, I gave a short introduction, but would love to hear from you, your story, how it started, the journey from Norway to the US and working with global companies. Please give us your journey in your own words.
Yeah, no, thanks. So I started my career at Deloitte, typical systems integrator type work, big implementations of ERP applications, CRM applications, those kind of things. Started in Oslo, Norway, but it's a global company. I got introduced to folks in the US and transferred here. And it was a great journey to learn about kind of the mechanics of driving a business transformation through technology, kind of what it takes beyond just implementing the technology, but also the change management and making it stick and making it drive value. One common theme there was I was often working on the sort of commercial side of transformation, so sales, marketing, etc., which introduced me to Diageo, the alcoholic beverage company, who had just gone through massive transformations on the operations side of the business and done an amazing job standardizing the back office and got a lot of economies of scale, but that didn't translate in the same way to the front side of the office. So like the sales and marketing. So I was initially engaged there as an architect to think about, okay, how do we create an agile technology architecture to support the sales side that integrates well with the standardized back office operational systems. And what I found through that journey is that part of it was technology, of course, in terms of design and things like that. But part of it was also embracing new ways of thinking. So this is some time ago, but it was embracing things like software as a service, agile delivery methodologies, etc. Because delivering technology to the front end of the business does require potentially more agile, iterative, try and fail type approach. And you need a different way to deliver that type of technology. I also got into a lot of business planning and performance management and things like that, initially with sales planning and revenue management, etc., but also then into integrated business planning, which is how I got introduced to McKinsey, because they do a lot of that type of work. A typical scenario might be an acquisition or a merger or a divestiture, etc., and then working through, quickly standing up a new way to see the performance opportunities of that transformation. And what we introduced was a digitized way to do that, using technologies to scale up what might have otherwise been done in an Excel sheet or hundreds of Excel sheets, do that in a way that is more scalable, both in terms of data and users, but also in terms of business KPIs and linking them together. How do you mathematically link a decision and supply chain back to what that means to the P&L or the sales forecast, et cetera, and vice versa? And then after some time with McKinsey, I joined Estée Lauder companies for a more strategic role around IT. So I led the strategy, architecture, and innovation, which I normally translated as, innovation is what could we do, strategy is what will we do, and architecture is how we do it. So it comes together in terms of execution. It's a great company, and it's interesting to be able to see the technology landscape of everything from upstream R&D all the way down to the consumer and everything in between. So it was a great opportunity to see how technology needs to kind of work together in an end-to-end kind of fashion across a company that deals with all those levels of the value chain, whereas other companies often focus either on retail or wholesale or manufacturing. Estée Lauder does all of the above. And the last couple of years, I've taken over the data analytics agenda, and with a heavy focus on AI and understanding how to leverage AI, how to build AI capabilities, how to increase the maturity of AI knowledge within the company, ultimately with the intent of driving value from AI.
So it's pretty interesting that it started on the consulting side, and then it became more integrated into big organizations. And your career has been changing slightly, still in tech and getting more strategic. But one thing that is interesting that you mentioned right now is that you came in with, for business planning, architecture, getting into applications, data architecture, and then AI. So how do you stay ahead with emerging trends? Because everybody sells you on specialization right now. Like the whole tech landscape is like you need to specialize in a certain area. So how do you balance such a broad skill set while staying ahead with emerging trends like AI?
Yeah. No, I think it's a great question. I think the short answer is to be curious. If this isn't fun, if this isn't kind of what you read about when you have a few minutes to yourself, whether it's an article or a book or a podcast or something like that, it's going to be hard work to really stay up to date on technology trends, etc. So I think, to me at least, I treat that curiosity as my spare time hobby of what's coming next, what are people saying, what's going on, what's the latest thing that's coming out, etc. But then to actually apply that in a business context, my personal opinion is you have to go a little more old school. It's about, okay, what is the business problem we're going to solve? Let's analyze the problem. What needs to be unlocked to turn this into value? How do we design this? How do we plan this? How do we adopt this, etc.? A lot of relatively old school ways of thinking in terms of implementing new technologies, and then finding that balance in terms of, okay, we heard about this new thing. It may be great. And let's place a bet and see if it works. And then if it's a small bet with low risk, you learn from it and you're okay to move on. But I think that's often where we get stuck is like, okay, we make 100 small bets and we don't move on. And I think that's where, again, the old school thinking comes in. Is like, okay, let's figure out the business case. What's the business opportunity here? How much weight should we put behind this to make this happen? And by weight, I mean not just money and cash, but people, leadership attention. What do we hold each other accountable for, etc.
Oh, so that's a great segue into the generative AI questions. So I love the old school thinking, back to understanding current state. So with Gen AI, especially with the OpenAI interface, it created a lot of excitement and panic in the enterprises, and it put a spotlight on an enterprise's data strategy. And many organizations were unprepared for this wave in terms of their disparate data sources, their unstructured data, and on and on. So tell us about, in this new world, how businesses might capture their current state and then use that to build out a foundational data strategy moving forward.
No, it's a great question. In fact, I remember a couple of years ago, there was even opinions that data didn't matter anymore because AI will just figure it out, just dump whatever you have and AI will turn it into magic. That didn't stick very long. I think people figured out, okay, that doesn't really work. You do need to feed it with good data. So then you have to think about your data architecture, what makes the data good, but also what makes it accessible. And that may be a little bit different than before, where it was, okay, I need to surface this up to a dashboard or something like that. But that same data now serves multiple purposes. It can fuel AI, it can fuel some machine learning, it can fuel a dashboard or an operational system. And architecting the data in a way where it can serve all of those purposes once is something the data architects should be thinking about as they design the new solutions. And AI will create potentially more sponsorship to move forward with that, because it's not always an exciting topic to say, we need to invest in data. It doesn't feel like something that gives an immediate ROI, but Gen AI has helped create a sense of urgency. Now, that said, good data is sort of a little bit in the eye of the beholder. Like, how do you define what good data is? Well, I think you define it by defining what you want to do with it. So you do have to do both. You have to work your way backwards from, I'm trying to achieve this thing. I'm going to use AI to achieve this thing. To do that, I need data for it. Okay, that gives me my top priorities for what data I need to clean up. That could be master data, like your product catalog or your customers or consumer, or it could be transactional data, external data. But let the momentum be guided by what you're trying to solve first, but let the approach be guided by a bigger vision around making this data accessible for all of these use cases, not just Gen AI.
I have a question to build on top of that, Stefan. So we know that there is huge importance for data to actually adopt generative AI and any type of AI, actually. But something we always talk about is that it wasn't that generative AI came in and data leaders were surprised that this is important. So what's surprising is that between data science, machine learning, all these practices that build on top of really good data, it seems that there's some enterprises that are really surprised, like that now I need to sell the business that my data strategy has to be in place. So our simple conclusion is that data leaders are actually not learning how to get buy-in from executives as part of it and to sell them on the future. But there's also the other part that says, were they comfortable in their own place? That like whatever we have is enough for us. I just want to know your thought about this.
I think getting buy-in it's always a complicated topic, because there isn't going to be a recipe of this, mainly because there's humans in the mix, right? So getting buy-in from a person or an executive is not just about the role they play or the ROI on a spreadsheet that makes this valuable. It's like, what does that person care about, and how do they get convinced that this is something important? Just making up two examples, right? Some may be more convinced by hard numbers, and some may be more convinced by an inspiring story of, imagine if we could. So I don't think there's like a one-shot recipe to get the buy-in, but I do think there's a unique opportunity here in that data was very back office before, and Gen AI is like pulling it forward. Now you can have conversations about, I wish we could, generate something around this. Okay, I need this data and that data. Now you have a little more pull and understanding that this needs to be resolved. Now, does that person need to know everything about the data architecture and best practices? Probably not, but tap into those for momentum and pull so that you can progress a general data strategy that's going to prepare you not only for Gen AI, but for the next use case of that data.
It's a great point. And then Rabia often says, when you're trying to get buy-in, he often says it's as much the messenger as the message. So any tips to data leaders or executives that are trying to get buy-in? How might they gain momentum within an organization to try to drive the vision?
I don't think this is just for data. This is for any kind of buy-in. I think it starts with empathy, right? Understanding who you're talking to, what's important to them. And that might be them as an individual, it might be them as a group, or it might be them as an organization that they represent. And the more you understand what's important to them, the more you can contextualize the message in a way that's relevant for them. Get energized behind, that they can get, factually convinced that this is the right thing to do. So I think step number one is probably listen before talking, like understand who you're talking with, about what, and then from there contextualize your message accordingly.
That's the empathy I love. So you mentioned in terms of strategy and tactics for AI enablement, a T-shaped model, and it creates a concise visualization that's very intuitive. So talk a little bit about how the T-shaped model or that approach helps simplify the problem and communicate the problem, and how that might break through in an enterprise.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting when talking about Gen AI is you'll have some conversations that say, well, we've always had AI, what's new about Gen AI? But I think it is very different, because AI before was machine learning, it was data scientists, it was largely a small group working in this corner of the office and working on this topic. And Gen AI is on our desktops. It's something that we're using in our day-to-day, or could use in our day-to-day. And I see it very similar to being, if we go back 40, 50 years, where the big company might have a big mainframe in the basement, and there would be, engineers working on that mainframe. Most of the business wouldn't even know it's there. It's just kind of doing things. Then the PC comes along and everybody has one on their desktop. Now they need to learn how to use that to their advantage. And I think Gen AI is a little bit the same way, that if we don't put it on people's desktops, they won't learn how to use this new tool and incorporate it into their day-to-day. And even the most basic functionality does have really good productivity gains. Maybe you don't need to attend all the meetings because the note taking is so good now that you can understand, what took place. So just even the small productivity bump, when you multiply it with thousands of employees, is worth it. More importantly, though, when people start getting some basic AI literacy, they can start imagining what actually is possible. Data scientists or IT people, as smart as many are, won't know exactly what the opportunity is in, let's say, a legal department or supply chain or store operations or whatever the function is. It's the people that are there day to day that will know what the opportunity is. So by equipping them with that basic literacy, they will be able to see what the potential is and come up with the best ideas that's going to drive a competitive advantage. Now, that's the horizontal of the T. The vertical of the T is going deep in specific areas. I think the first motivation should be to learn, dip your toes into it. And it's not just learning the technology, it's learning about, what does that do to us? What does change management look like with an AI tool? What do the risk conversations look like? The legal conversations, privacy conversations look like? If we don't chew on these topics, we'll never learn about them just by reading or listening to others who have opinions about it. You kind of have to try it out a little bit yourself. But best case, maybe there are some opportunities that could be a real competitive advantage. Most likely they will be probably where you already have a competitive advantage, but now you can use AI to kind of double it up or create some leverage and get more value out of it. Or you have some competitive advantage that you didn't know you had. Typical examples might be that you sit on data that your competitors don't have, or you have working relationships in the value chain that your competitors don't have. Whatever it is that you might have that your competitor doesn't is probably the most likely one to give you a competitive advantage and put AI on top of it. Doing something completely brand new, a whole new value stream, etc., could be interesting, but probably a higher risk, lower probability of success initially. But again, I think the main motivation of doing it is learning from it, because this space it's hard to just listen to advisors. You have to kind of feel it firsthand as an organization, as an individual, as an executive, as a developer, what this is about. And that is going to inform you and guide you the rest of the journey.
So for that the horizontal positions the enterprise for that vertical breakthrough, which is a nice, concise way to visualize this or conceptualize this problem. So we talked a lot about the opportunities, the breakthrough opportunities in the enterprise and process improvements and optimizations and revenue driving. What are some of the concerns an enterprise might have? So we hear a lot about slogans like AI is not going to replace your job, but somebody with AI will replace your job, and AI is going to augment you and not necessarily replace you. And what are your opinions on sort of some of the disruption enterprises need to be prepared for that are not the opportunities and the revenue drivers that sort of get most of the sunlight? What's your opinion on some of the risks, threats, and disruptions enterprises might encounter as we go forward?
It's a long list, right? They could be to the individuals, like you said, there may be a feel of threat that my job can now be automated. I don't need, I won't be needed anymore. And, that is just reality of any technological advancement since, whenever, however far back you go, it changed what we do. But first of all, it doesn't mean replacing the person. It might replace what that person did, and that person will now do something else. I think embracing that and getting ahead of that, both as individuals, as us, in our day-to-day, imagining our day job with AI let's get ahead of it. Let's find out, how do I use AI to do my job better or different, or maybe part of my job isn't that relevant anymore. What's the new part that I can add to my job that becomes relevant? It's just the fact that this is going to change, and it is the fact that we have to change with it. And at the organizational level, there's of course all sorts of risks around this. There's legal concerns. Who owns something that's generated by Gen AI? Who owns whatever the Gen AI was taught on? There's a lot of pitfalls. Architecturally, how's the data flowing, and privacy? How is my personal information being used or potentially abused? Those are all risks to get ahead of, but they're risks to action, not risks to block. So if there's a concern about, and there is, all of the above are concerns, each one should be, flip the coin into making it an action. Okay, what is our perspective on intellectual property on something that we create with Gen AI? Let's figure it out. Let's not just say that, oh, that's a risk and stand still. Same with privacy, same with legal. And I think the more we can create the right guardrails to create a little bit of momentum, the more we'll learn and the better the guardrails will become. But standing still, I don't think is a good idea.
One thing I wanted to comment on regarding people afraid or seeing like there's fear that AI is going to take their job. It's interesting because the bright side of this is that a lot of people, or like this is just like my simple opinion, is that a lot of people get busy into their 9 to 5 or what they do, that introducing AI could save them the time to explore other stuff that they can do that they didn't know that they were able to do because they never had the time. But I guess like we as human beings, our nature is to look at the bad side of things first, I guess. And now I want to build on a question on that, Stefan, is that in any AI strategy and enterprises, this is very attractive, which is the time, taking my time back or my employees' time back with AI. But when is it this responsibility is passed to the employee or the department leaders to say, okay, I saved your employees' time with AI. What are you going to do with it? That chain of how do I get to ROI? Because that's, at least in training, that I helped save your employee an hour a day. And that's a lot of money on companies with 5,000 plus employees or 20,000. So how does that chain going to ROI for a business?
Well, how does it go into measurable ROI, right? That's part of the challenge. How do you turn it into measurable ROI? I think that problem is not necessarily new. When robotics process automation was huge, I mean, it's still big, but it's sort of, 10 years ago was a big thing to automate processes, particularly in terms of, interacting with applications. I think a lot of companies and consultants had the promise that, this will automate so many hours of everybody's workday, therefore multiply that with some hourly rate and there are the savings. But then when you look at the P&L, it's not showing up. Why not? Like you said, you're going to save 10 million in automation, but it's not showing up on the P&L. And part of the problem is, fingers and toes problem, meaning if you automate part of a role, it doesn't really make the role go away. You still have to pay for that role. And most people, they don't want to be idle, right? So they'll fill that time that they saved by doing something else and hopefully something more productive, something more valuable, etc. But that is one reason why it doesn't show up as savings on the P&L. But I do think if you took a macro view and lots of steps back, you would see productivity go up. It just may not be directly tied to that one project we automated 10 years ago, that one Gen AI solution that we're deploying now. But if you pursue this general strategy, I'm sure if you go, take a few steps back and you take revenue divided by employees or some very basic KPI like that, you would see that productivity does go up. And it's not just because of saving time that you don't have to pay for. It's that time gets reallocated to do something more meaningful and more valuable. And in fact, just the interaction with Gen AI requires a person to elevate themselves to think a bit more about the logic, because whereas automation before was very programmatic, step 1, step 2, step 3, done. It's a little more complex to figure out how to explain to an AI what I really want, not just what I said of what I want, but what's the context for what I want that the Gen AI needs to think about. even that thought process really elevates kind of the thinking about what's success for that job role looks like.
That's a great point. So then leaders, so if we have a team of dozens of people and we've saved every person on the team an hour a day, it's sort of an opportunity cost where if they just decide to go golf for the hour, it's hard to measure the value there. So is there a responsibility on the leaders at the granular level, the department, sub-department, team level, to reshuffle around what people are doing, where we can reshuffle them into other value-added activities as we start to reduce, like you had mentioned, partial components of their job, not necessarily the complete function?
Yeah, I mean, it probably makes sense to combine. If that's what the company is looking to do, is to get immediate bottom line savings impact from this, then it probably makes sense to couple a Gen AI initiative with other initiatives so that you can make those structural changes. So the most obvious one is, an organizational restructure and redefining the roles to fit the new workload. But it could also be other things as well. The technology landscape, the other elements of operating the business, do it as one big transformation, then it becomes easier to kind of say, yeah, this transformation, which included restructuring AI and automation and other components, yielded this much improvement to the bottom line. That we can kind of measure it, and it's a one-time benefit and it's a transformational benefit. But I don't think that's like the long-term strategic benefit. I think it's real, yeah, and you want to look for productivity, but I think the real value is going to be a little bit harder to measure in one project at a time or one quarter at a time, because it's going to be a cultural change that over time is going to drive more productivity, more value creation, and whether that extra time goes to, my gut feel is that not all of that's going to go to the golf course, right? A lot of us are ambitious and we want more personal time, but have we really played more golf as things have become more digitized over the last 20 years? Probably not, right? We just get more ambitious about doing more in the roles that we are, and that translates to more business value.
Exactly. And this sort of reshapes now your associates and what you're looking for in an associate. So how important is HR in this transformation?
That's a good question. I think relate back to sort of the T-shaped approach of AI. I think HR really needs to understand this by getting their hands dirty, partially to understand what it is and what it isn't, but so that they really have an understanding of the employees in the organization that start adopting AI as well. How is this changing what they do? How is it changing, what success looks like to them? What does good performance look like, etc.? And then very tactically try to get ahead of that in terms of, okay, how do we now steer this sort of energy that might be building up in the organization, whether it's how do you articulate a performance goal? How do you articulate accountability? If you're co-delivering with an AI, who's accountable? Is it the person that created the AI or trained the AI, or is it the user of that AI tool that's accountable? There are some topics there to get ahead of for sure within the HR department.
Going vertically on that T-shape, Gen AI, of course, is one of the subjects, but overall, I think it's a pretty interesting concept also, innovation in general and experimentation in enterprise. So, Stefan, one question for you. Now with Gen AI, there's a lot of AI tools out there, like release as SaaS services. And of course, it's attractive for enterprises to take a look outside instead of getting my team busy in what they don't need to waste their time on. I can just buy this tool and figure it out. But we always talk about, as you can buy it and other enterprises can too, so it's not differentiating you in any way. So how do you find, in Gen AI or not, a good idea that is worth experimenting with and keep that team agile as possible internally to get some result that can grow and then be sold to the business to grow and invest in?
It's sort of like the buy versus build debate. Yeah, I think it says always.
It is part of it, and part of it is something very unique that we're willing to build, not because it's just differentiates us, it's also new tech or new skills that needs to be learned. So the team has to be ready in many ways to actually run forward.
I think I think it's really important to first be super clear on what you're trying to achieve from a business perspective, and then back into, okay, what's the best way to achieve it? And you may find that there's an off-the-shelf solution that will help us achieve it. But off-the-shelf solution doesn't mean that everybody's achieving the same thing. I mean, the off-the-shelf solution is still just a tool. It's not you applying that tool. So I don't think that buying something off the shelf means you've lost the competitive advantage. It's how you apply it in your business that's going to create the competitive advantage. So I would definitely recommend starting from like, okay, we want to achieve this, and okay, let's see, do we buy versus build, and use whatever framework you want in terms of, do we have the capabilities? Do we want to build the capabilities? What's the cost of doing this? What's the risk of doing it? And not be scared that buying means not competitive advantage. It's the applicability that helps. The other thing that I thought was kind of funny, specifically the first year after the OpenAI explosion, was if you have a really good idea and you want to build something, double check with yourself if that idea is that unique that you're the only one that's going to come up with it. Because I remember some ideas we had, and also other companies that I talked with had some great ideas, and they started building things, and suddenly it was available off the shelf because other people thought of it. Now they spent millions of dollars building something that they now have to maintain and upgrade when you could get it for a fraction of the price off the shelf. So sometimes it's worth just waiting a little bit and see if it comes off the shelf and becomes available. All of that said, it sounds like I'm very for the buy approach, which I often am. But the benefit of the build approach is also it really teaches you what's happening under the covers. A little bit of build in your mix makes you a better buyer of technology as well, because now you know which questions to ask. How is the data flowing? How is this supported? What's the security look like, etc. And I think the best way for an organization to learn that is to build some things themselves.
And does that help? Like you said, the building makes you a better buyer. So the ability to create a baseline solution, so a baseline model, we need to solve for something, and we can come up with a baseline solution for it that's useful. It is useful to the business. And then let's say, well, maybe we can buy this, automate it. Let's remove the maintenance from our responsibility. The ability to have that baseline should allow us, like you were saying, make us better buyers, should allow us more leverage if we're negotiating to buy, because it's like, well, I can walk away from the table. I don't really need your solution. It's great. Maybe it's going to add some elements of lift over our baseline, but I don't really need it. So I think that's a great insight that that building makes you a better buyer. I've always loved that and advocated for the baseline models as not just something that's useful for the enterprise, but also leverageable when you're negotiating with vendors. So I think that's a great insight. I had another question about a little bit more personal opinion about consulting versus the business. You've done both. Tell me what you loved about the consulting, what you hated about it, what you love about the enterprise, and which maybe isn't so shiny.
They're both fun. Let's start with that. What I loved about consulting is generally it has a transformative nature to it. It's like, let's get in there and fix this and change this. And there's sort of a bit of an adrenaline rush that comes with it. There's often a clear definition of what done looks like, somewhat of a finite scope to the problem that you're trying to solve. And ultimately, in consulting, the product is the people. So those organizations tend to invest heavily in coaching and mentorship and creating a culture of growth as individuals. And so I think it's a great way to inject some coaching and learning into careers to have a stint in consulting. I'd recommend it to anyone. Now, the fun side of being on the industry side of things is that you feel a deeper sense of ownership to an agenda. It feels like your baby. You're not helping somebody else. It's your agenda. You feel maybe a deeper sense of sort of identity with the brand and etc. And then I don't know if this is a con or a pro, but there's definitely a lot more complexity because now definition of done is a little vaguer. Definition of success gets a little more complicated because it's not just that one project. You have to think long-term, medium-term, short-term. You have to think, these stakeholders, those stakeholders. It's a more complex environment and a longer-term play where you have to think about, okay, how do I create value in ways that we can kind of celebrate that this was achieved, but we don't want to do quick wins that paint us into a corner or create a dead end solution. And so you have to, the things you have to think about on the enterprise side is much broader. across multiple dimensions, whether it's time or function or team or technology, etc. I think it's very useful to be on both sides, meaning having played on both sides for two reasons. I think if you've been in an industry and you go to consultant, you have a better understanding, again, the empathy reference that we made earlier, you have a better understanding of what your clients want and what kind of situation they live in, and the more complex world potentially they live in than that one thing that you're proposing as a consultant to help them with. And I think that helps you become a better partner as a consultant. On the other side, if you've been a consultant, I think on the enterprise side, you become better at how to use consultants and how to get the most value out of them, how to partner with them. And I do see companies often, they sort of outsource a problem to the consultant, like, oh, we need to fix this, but I don't really have time or people or leadership attention. So let's just hire a consultant to take care of the problem. Those situations, they typically end up with either a solution that doesn't get deployed or a PowerPoint that gathers dust, depending on what type of consultancy it is. I really feel like leveraging a consultant should be a close partnership, as mutually beneficial as possible. And that's typically when you're going to drive some real change.
You just answered my next question. Which was going to be, since you've been on both sides of the aisle there from the consultancy perspective and the business perspective, which is unique, that'll allow you to understand how to optimize that relationship from both ends. You gave us some really good insights there on how from the business side to optimize that relationship, maximize the value from the consultancy. Any other tips there? Any other tips on a business to say, hey, we're investing in this consultancy initiative, and how do we maximize the value, reduce the amount of waste with the relationship in terms of process and outcome?
I think one, figure out what the partnership looks like. So partnering at the leadership level, partnering at the executional level, both so that the progress is done hand in hand, but also so there can be a little bit of exchange of information and knowledge. The more the consultant has access to your company's nuances and details and context, the better the advice that consultant is going to give you. And the more you can learn from that consultant to whatever niche expertise they bring to the table, the more you can bring that knowledge to serve you longer term. The second thing I would think about is plan for what happens after the engagement before you start the first engagement. I think many start with like, well, let's do this 3-month thing, a 6-month thing. And then when that's up on the last day, it's like, okay, what's next? Let's have that last stair code to decide what's next. And I think that's too late. I think when you start the first engagement, have an idea of what the longer term next steps look like, because it will take time to mobilize for that. It will take time to align for it. And it will definitely shape what that engagement looks like if it's clear what it's leading into next. Now, at the individual level, I would recommend to anyone to try to find ways in their career journeys to play on both sides, because it's hugely rewarding and it's great for personal growth to have that exposure on both sides.
More of a coming from curiosity kind of question, because I understand especially those big consultancy firms, they apply certain frameworks for research, idea generation, and even planning for implementations. Did that benefit you in your day-to-day or strategically once you worked with enterprises? Like you come in with all these frameworks, I'm sure they are valuable, but which one do you think that we can talk about that says like this served a really good purpose? Like everywhere I went, it was a really good tool, a nice Swiss Army knife in certain scenarios.
If you're looking for a specific one, I don't know if I can pick one out, but definitely the value of frameworks and templates are great if they're used correctly. Maybe this is a little bit of a parallel to the buy versus build on buying technologies. I think it's the same with frameworks. You should always use them. Why invent things from scratch? But should you copy and paste and just do it as is and assume that drives value? Probably not. So use the framework as an accelerator, as a starting point, as guidance. And, the consulting firms do this really well, right? They share knowledge, they share experiences, and they package that up as IP. But when the actual project happens, it often is down to the individuals on the ground and how they leverage that framework, not the framework itself, that determines the success of the project. And I think non-consulting companies could probably benefit more from investing back in frameworks when, learn from the work that they do, turn it into templates, not to copy and paste, but to accelerate that the next agenda.
So those frameworks, they provide that general structure or scaffolding that then the analysts can take and tailor into the particular solutions for the enterprise.
Yeah, exactly.
And that refines the whole process, which is really neat. Who in the consulting firms? So are there analysts that their jobs are specifically to develop frameworks? In other words, is there the R&D part, I would imagine, in the consulting area is where the people are trying to come up with new templates and optimize things?
I mean, for the larger firms, yes, definitely. There are people who do research, specific research on what's happening out there, what are companies doing, what are other vendors doing to get the trends, and people have that as their day job. But I also think it's built into the culture of when you engage, and your measurement actually of success is often not just did you deliver this project to this client, but what did you bring back to the firm in terms of intellectual property, etc. And the fact that you measured on it makes it part of the culture that every time you deliver something, you're also learning something on behalf of the organization. How do you incorporate that into whether it's knowledge frameworks or templates or even just presentations? I mean, many of the consulting companies have internal forums where they share what they learned, they share how they overcame challenges, and that's a more sort of informal way of sharing knowledge and experience. And then, like I said, in some cases, people get literally measured on how many papers they wrote or how many templates they created. It's the product, right? That is the product of consulting. So there's this heavy investment in, you called it R&D. I think that's a good word for it. It's R&D for how to do better consulting.
Yep. And if we flip that to the enterprise, how serious should an enterprise, maybe Fortune 500, maybe outside of Fortune 500, how serious should they take their own intellectual property strategies? Should they have a patent strategy? Should they have a strategy around their IP? Should they be thinking in terms of developing their own IPs as a strategy in their organization, even if they're not a tech company or a research company, just average company?
A short answer, yes. And especially for the area that the company is dealing with. I mean, if it's a non-tech company, should it pursue tech patents? Maybe if it excites the tech organization and it can put some residual energy into it, maybe it's worth it. And you never know. Maybe one of those patents do turn into something that could turn into a business model or a new venture of some sort. And there's plenty of companies that have done that where they create whole new businesses or revenue streams or something based on something that wasn't necessarily core to their original business, but it came out of maybe something they did to support the original business. The intellectual property is critical to keep you a step ahead of your competition, but it's not something you can rest on. It's not a money maker on its own. So definitely not a silver bullet in terms of winning with the competition. But I do think it's important to invest in intellectual property, especially in the core area of your business.
And it could have some intangible impact, like you mentioned, the tech company. If you are a company that's non-tech and you do have some type of innovation engine and you are trying to produce patents, it might be attractive to engineers that might not have generally looked in this company's direction. Like, oh, this company isn't somewhere where I think I want to bring my tech skills. But if there's some type of engine that's innovating and trying to develop their own products, it might attract talent that they may never have had access to previously.
I think that is great comment. I 100% agree. It's not always easy to not be in tech and attract the highest tech talent. And if you're a high performing technologist, you're going to want to look for a company that's going to be fun, it's going to excite you, but also going to challenge you and grow you. It's a great point. If you show that, look, we've got these patents, we've got a huge innovation agenda around tech, etc. I absolutely think that's really important to attract the right talent.
And that ties into your point about be a good builder helps you be a better buyer. These two things sort of relate together. Like in the process of being a better builder, this could be your innovation engine. So you could be getting these parallel impact from this sort of a strategy that's helping on multiple different directions in a company. So I think that's an interesting one. It's unexplored. You don't hear a lot of companies talking about their IP strategies, especially if they're not in the business of technology or invention. So I think it's an interesting angle.
I had one more on the technical debt, just because it's important and it's in every enterprise. We always say, or I always consider from teams I worked with, and that every 3 to 5 years, any company needs to look at an application, review it, even if it's not old, even if it's doing exactly what it needs to do. But how do you, Stefan, like with the teams that you worked with as a leader, it's like, how do you balance between technical debt, the pressure of maintaining legacy systems and make sure everything is running, and at the same time, innovate? And as you guys mentioned, the conversation builds into this also is that even the people that you have, the technologists, the high performing ones specifically that you have, how do you keep that balance for them so they are interested? Because everybody wants to do the new thing, new shiny thing, definitely viable for the business. And then again, the pressure of maintaining legacy systems.
Yeah, it's a great topic. I think most people in an IT function struggle with this, mainly because everybody will nod their heads that tech debt is something that needs to be addressed. Like, it's hard to say, no, I'm for tech debt. So people will always nod their heads, yeah, let's do this. But then the next step is like, okay, what does that actually mean? Does that mean spending $10 million on cleaning up old tech? Or does it mean not doing anything new? It hits a bit of a brick wall when the head nodding needs to turn into action. And I think a couple of levers can help. One is general education on what tech debt is and why it's important, etc. Just so that people can understand that, well, if we do a point solution here, it's probably going to not allow you to do it the next cool thing that comes afterwards, for example. Or, this is adding cost or risk or security vulnerability or whatnot. So people can go beyond the head nod agreement and a little deeper understanding that this is actually something important to address. The second piece, I think, is to find a way to measure it. Because many companies and many people, they like to see something that they can measure. Whether you're measuring, how fast you can run or potentially keep you motivated to do certain things. It's the same in an organization. So if you can measure your tech debt, now you can start talking about, is it going up? Is it going down? How much did we achieve something? How much money should we put behind it? So having a good sense of, what does your technology landscape look like, with every item in your technology landscape somewhat designated as, is it tech debt or not? And maybe it's not that binary. Maybe it's sort of an in-between. You have to figure out what scale you want to use. You want to keep it simple, but slightly nuanced. Now you can drive some conversations and say, look, we're tech debt spiraled in this area over the last 3 years. We think this is a year to pause and reinvest and consolidate a little bit more before we go into the next set of tech. Or you could put it into people's portfolios and make them accountable for their portfolio of technologies and say, okay, this is what your portfolio looks like. For your next proposal, don't just propose what's new, but propose what's going to replace. And thereby you can kind of force the conversation in a little bit of the day-to-day when you introduce the newness. And then measure people on it. So if tech debt is really important or it's become really bad in one area, like let's make that something that we measure from a performance perspective, so it becomes the motivator. People are humans. We do what we're motivated to do. And if we're motivated to just deploy that silver bullet solution in 3 months because that's going to make our stakeholder happy, then that is what we're going to do first. Everything else is going to come second. But if we're motivated to be measured on, I put in that 3-month solution, but I also took out 2 other solutions because of the way I went about it. It's not necessarily just the choice, it's the how. If they're motivated to do that, they will do that. And if they have the tools and the data and the KPIs and the support from like enterprise architecture and others that can help guide it, it doesn't become so much a question around, do I do something new or do I clean up the old? But it's more about, how do I do the new so it's cleaning up the old on the way?
Get multiple wins. No, I totally agree.
Yeah, it's a win-win.
We talked about this a little bit offline, but the idea that, and I don't want to offend anybody listening, but enterprise architecture seems to always like trying to catch up, where with all the innovation, all the new tools coming in and applications introduced to every ecosystem in an enterprise architecture seems like, with its processes and frameworks, always trying to catch current state, never got to a point in most enterprises, I'm guessing, like, or assuming, it's not getting to a point where it's actually seeing what future state is going to be like. How do you think enterprise architecture can change or tweak its approach so it can be on the same pace as innovation teams and tech teams that are in high pace?
First, by starting to acknowledge that that is important, to be ahead of the technology and not behind. And maybe one way is to combine innovation and architecture in some shape or form, whether it's under the same leadership or even an integrated team. And then you could say that the innovation team's job is to inform what enterprise architecture needs to get ahead of in terms of establishing standards. I think a lot of companies that I've seen, particularly when I was a consultant, I think enterprise architects often come across as like the homework checking type that, checks if you've done things the right way, or the risk avert people that you need to convince that this is something can be done, and that hurts the engagement model in enterprise architecture. If you feel like they are the gates that you need to get through, first of all, you're probably not going to engage them until the last minute when you actually need to, and you're probably going to apply all your political power to try to shove that thing through. It's just not the right engagement model. So I think an EA team should aspire to engage at the front end of all of these conversations by being an innovator, by being a direction setter, by being at the in front of the team, kind of being the flag bearer of, hey, we're going in this direction. And if people see that, oh, we're going in this direction, they're going to naturally follow and say, okay, I want to go that direction too. Can you tell me a little bit how to do it? And it becomes prescriptive rather than reactive on how to architect it well. Yeah, so I think it's absolutely key that enterprise architecture stays ahead of the game. Now, with things popping up every 2 weeks, new technologies, new evolutions, there's going to be a lot of questions around, well, can we do this? Can we do that? And it becomes at some point not sustainable for a team to be fully up to date on absolutely everything that happens. So there needs to be a balancing act between the two. And maybe the way to do it is to split it up, that there are certain individuals or teams that are particularly focused on innovation, on research, on consolidating the insights of what's going on in the industry back to the organization, so that there isn't this constant distraction of new technology. And then the last thing I think is a key enabler for architects, partially to be involved in the process, but also to be seen as an accelerator rather than somebody who slows things down. Define some swim lanes for the organization on how to do certain things so that they can move fast, but in somewhat of a predefined, architecture or guardrails, or it doesn't just have to be technology choices, but how to go about certain things. So if you say, we've defined these 6 archetypes or 6 swim lanes of how to solve certain business problems, ideally you'd find that any new thing that comes across, or 80% of those new things, will fit in one of those swim lanes and is already quote unquote pre-approved. You don't have to go through all the red tape to get people approved, but at the same time, people now have templatized approaches to do what they were going to do actually faster than maybe what they thought about earlier. So I think there's room for EA to be ahead of the game if structured properly, and to be an accelerator rather than a gatekeeper for the organization if it's structured correctly.
And you mentioned it 100%. The way it makes sense especially for a product-oriented kind of department, where EAs needs to be close to the action, not in their own tower, and people visit them in whatever process of innovation or building something new. So yeah, no, I totally agree.
And you mentioned a little bit about the politics and the gatekeeping in there. So, organization models are getting reimagined, roles are getting reimagined. We talked about that. We just talked about that with the generative AI disruption or transformation. If I'm a CIO of a Fortune 500 company, what does my C-suite look like in 5 years?
With your peers or with the reports to the CEO?
My team. What's the C-suite look like in 5 years? Because we see a lot of prominence, a lot of the security officers are becoming more and more important in the world. Of course, the data and the AI officers, the roles of technology officers and information officers, they're all sort of being reimagined and refined and redefined. And I think I know your answer to this because we talked a little bit offline about this. But what do you think a C-suite might look like from that senior team in 5 years? What do we need? What do we need to have at the table there?
I think, technology, the role of technology has grown so much that over time, having one person be the lead for technology is just too much for one person. So new CXO titles came along, like CTO or CDO, CISO, etc. And then now I'm seeing, at least when I'm reading and hearing from others, is that, okay, maybe there's too many now because the responsibility and accountability has become too vague. There's too many CXOs that are owning portions of a technology agenda. So it's not quite clear, who's the throat to choke and who actually is guiding the way here. I think it's a balancing act. I think reality is that it is too big for one person to own the guidance and direction for everything that relates to technology, whether it's cybersecurity or operations or innovation, or it's a huge area of responsibility. So it does, to me personally, this is my personal opinion, it does make sense to think about carving up what could just be considered one big lump of technology into something that's a little bit more manageable in terms of agendas. What that exactly means in terms of titles, I think we'll see that pendulum swing. I'm kind of curious to see if the chief AI officer, if that title is going to stick around, or if it's something to get over this hump of newness that is just too much for existing roles to take on top of their previous jobs. But I think thinking, for example, like a chief product officer or something like that can take a product view of the technology that's being delivered could be one way to split certain things up. Splitting out this chief security or the CISO from CIO could also make sense in terms of segregation of duties.
Yeah, well, we talked offline a little bit, and you had mentioned, like you had just said, it's not so much about the title, but it's about the function. And the functions are getting refined, and they're getting distilled, and they're getting reshuffled. And like you said, chief data officer sort of had it sort of came up, and now you have the chief AI officer, and like maybe this is a transient role just to get the organization enabled. Maybe enabled everybody's the chief AI officer, or everybody should be thinking in terms of this. And the world is changing so quick. It'd be interesting insights about what does that senior team look like in 5 years in terms of who do we need at the table to be at best in class. And it's changing so quick, and every week it seems like there's a different take, and it's just a very interesting. I
think the other challenge is that it's down to the individuals that fill these roles, maybe more so than what the title is, etc. Are you about to drive a transformation? What type of transformation probably influences more the type of person you want for that role rather than the title of that role. And I think that's what's happening as well. A company knows they need a certain person in their C-suite or in their executive suite, and they sort of reshuffle the titles to make that room. And when you take a step back, it may not kind of make sense when you see all the titles, but when you kind of peel back the onion, you see, it's so that they can create the right mix of diverse thought at the leadership table that company needed at that point in time, which I do think is critical for any level of the organization is to have that diversity of thoughts and diversity of expertise to drive pretty much any agenda forward.
I want to, Stefan, ask a question more on professional development and learning and all that. Have you had mentors? Did you ever strive to find people that you can actually be their mentee? Or have you mentored people? Do you believe in this concept? How much does it speed up your professional development? Just give us your thoughts.
Yeah, I absolutely believe in that concept. And I do think that's something that consulting kind of teaches the value of, because as I mentioned before, in consulting, the human is kind of the product. So it's R&D, is mentorship, is coaching, it's making those products as best as possible. So it's really ingrained in the day to day. I mean, I recall when I made my last switch to consulting, the first few weeks, I was like, well, after every meeting, I'm getting feedback on how I did in that meeting. And it's a little bit overwhelming initially because you're thinking, well, did I always do something wrong, and et cetera, until you start embracing it and you see, no, it's not about doing something wrong. It's about this continuous engine of mentorship and coaching, which wasn't necessarily hierarchical either. It was peers and junior and so on, built into the culture. Ideally, we should bring that into the non-consulting organizations as well, and be brave enough to both share feedback and receive feedback, knowing that the intent is always positive, whether it's the feedback we want or not. Now, in terms of actual mentorship, I do think it's really important both to seek mentorship and give mentorship. And maybe I'm a little bit biased because I find that activity very fun and it's self-rewarding in itself. But it doesn't always come on its own. You may have to find your own mentors, and they may not necessarily be a boss or senior person. It could be, you don't necessarily need to label it, but just think about it as, who can I go to share some thoughts with and get some fresh perspective that I hadn't thought about before? And that mentor may not give you even good advice. It would just be a new input to your own thought process, and you have to follow your own advice. Maybe you need 3 mentors or 5 people that you know are going to give opposite advice, that can then give you all that sort of, dislodging that you need in your own thought processes to figure out what your own advice is going to be. I absolutely don't think you need to agree with your mentor. I feel like sometimes I've learned a lot from people I don't agree with, not necessarily because they've proven me right that the opposite is true, but they've forced me to rethink what I thought was true. And like I said, dislodge some of my thinking. I was just going to say, providing mentorship, I think is really rewarding because it's an investment in peers and friends and colleagues, and seeing that yield growth and things like that. I think for many, and at least for me, that's just rewarding in itself, but also in a more, I guess, selfish way, it helps build more capabilities around you. And it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who reports to you, but if you can mentor and share your knowledge and your skills with others around you, you're basically multiplying yourself in many ways. And then you can achieve more than you can if you just have to tell people what to do, or if you have to try to convince people what needs to be done. And I often recommend people in the sort of early careers to find those mentorship opportunities, because being a mentor is also something that requires some practice. And the motivation for them should be, well, imagine if there was 3 of you that could do what you do, how much more you could do. And then what that does for your career opportunities in terms of next steps.
A good quick question on the mentorship. So I hear you sort of see in pop culture that the remote work is somehow affecting junior associates and their ability to be mentored by senior associates. So what's your opinion on return to work, stay remote, stay hybrid? Does any of this matter? And is there any impacts to any of these things? Or is it just really sort of not even worth debating?
I think it's definitely worth debating, because I don't know if the answer is very clear. So I do think it's worth talking about. From my personal experience, I was used to working remote. COVID made it more make it more normal to work remotely. But then finding energy from seeing colleagues at work was kind of the value for me. Whether or not I'm actually collaborating more with them in person or Zoom, I'm not sure. But creating that sense of belonging and we're in this together, I think there's some value to that. But is it worth, for some people, like in the New York area, to commute 2 hours each way and spend 4 hours of their day on a train or a bus instead of producing valuable, deliveries for the business or getting rest for themselves so that they can be even more productive in the business? It's a balancing act. And I think my personal opinion is the hybrid approach of a few days in the office and a few days remote strikes that balance. A lot of my one-on-one mentorship type meetings, they happen virtually. I don't think that's necessarily, I don't think it gets in the way of mentorship, but it is easier to create that emotional feeling of belonging if you're together as a group once in a while. It's completely my personal opinion. There's so many opinions about this, and I absolutely think it's worth debating.
The same opinion I have is that it seems to be settling on some type of hybrid approach. Like our gradient is finding its minimum at the hybrid approach, where you still maintain some of that chemistry, but then you can reduce the amount of 2-hour commutes at the same time. So which then expands your ability to recruit, because people that might be 2 hours away that don't want to drive 2 hours might be the perfect fit, and you don't want to sort of isolate them because of a policy like return to work. So I think I share that opinion that hybrid seems to be where we're going. It seems to be maybe optimal. I can't prove it's optimal, but anecdotally, it seems like it works well.
Yeah, I agree.
So rapid fire round, fun and thought provoking. Most overhyped tech trend right now.
Not sure it's hype anymore, but I think metaverse was probably a little bit overhyped the way it came out, guns blazing. That said, I could definitely see that there's some opportunity to create online experiences that are a little more immersive than what we see today. I mean, if you go shopping online now, it's not that different from 25 years ago. It's an HTML page with some product images and a buy button. Not super inspirational, not very engaging. So I don't think it's dead. I think it could come up and maybe a different user experience that drives different consumer behavior and potentially in a more social manner than the sort of one-on-one interaction that we have with websites today.
Yeah, I agree. The second one is one technology breakthrough you think will change the business in the next 5 years.
I actually don't think it's technology that needs to break through. I think it's the businesses. I think the technology is so far ahead now of what the businesses have adopted to a fault, right? We're reading about, new models and things coming out every week in the technology space. But if you look at what's applied, it's like a decade behind, a little bit too much now. But so I think the biggest breakthrough is not going to be the next technology unlock. The unlocks are there. It's the business pursuing the technology that's there today. Even if the business pursued Gen AI as it was 2 years ago, it would be a breakthrough. Yeah.
I see your point. A book or a thinker that had a major influence on your leadership style. Or it could be a person that you know.
Ooh, I had an elementary school teacher that generally didn't like to follow the rules. And I'm not necessarily the most rule breaking person out there, but I always think back to him in terms of like, is this really a rule, or is this just how we've done it before? And let's do it a little bit differently. And I often think about him in terms of how he taught, is that he didn't necessarily like do something completely different or that was against how it should be done, but he didn't accept that the way we've done it before is the way we should do it next. And I was 10 at that age, so he made quite an impression.
I agree with you. I have the same one for a middle school teacher. Same thing. He had a different style and just marked right there. Like I always comes to my head. All right. Next one is, what's a technology you worked on early in your career that now feels totally outdated?
All of it. I read some article around like every 3 years, 50% of your technology knowledge is out the window, not relevant. I remember tuning SQL statements. I remember trying to make servers handle more concurrent users. But, all of it feels kind of less relevant today.
Slowly. Yeah. Slowly get in there.
The elementary school answer, that was great. That was a great answer. And Rabia, you had a similar experience. Interesting that like when you ask this question, a lot of people refer back to sort of these early memories. It shows you how important you were around in those years really matters.
How formative it is. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to throw at you a last one from my side, Stefan. One, looking ahead as a professional and executive that has been working with AI data, done a lot of transformations and all these enterprises that continue to evolve. What's one piece of advice you would give to CEOs and CIOs trying to future-proof their organizations today?
I unfortunately don't think there's such a thing as future-proof. I feel like that is a little bit of an empty promise, because how possibly could you future-proof? You don't know what the future holds. I do think, my soapbox speech is be super clear on the outcome, whether it's at the corporate executive level of where the company is going or the outcome of a specific initiative or a specific agenda, because it informs so many other things. First of all, it fuels motivation. It fuels energy to get it done. It fuels day-to-day pragmatic decisions when you have to kind of make a trade-off between, whatever's best practice and what's ever tactical, a long-term decision versus a short-term decision. all of those things are anchored based on having a very clear view of what you're trying to achieve. I think future proofing based on quote unquote best practices, I think that often turns into large investments that don't go anywhere, or forever projects that don't result in anything. Now, if we mean by future proof, don't be short sighted, I think that's maybe a different way to look at it. It's like if you're always solving for what's happening the next 3 months with no view of what's coming next, then you're definitely the opposite of future proof. So I do think it's important to take multiple time horizons when you look at what needs to get done, whether it's long-term, medium-term, and short-term. Be okay with the long-term being directionally very clear, but potentially not very precise on how to get there. And the short-term be pragmatic. You may have to zigzag a little bit, but as long as it's pointing towards that long-term North Star, you know that you're progressing in generally the right direction.
Do you believe, by the way, this is a question building on top of this one. Do you believe in enterprises that do let's say for me, I feel like 5-year roadmap makes sense, let's say for a tech department of what we're going to do next, for example. But some enterprises are going 10, 15. I'm not talking vision. I'm talking actual roadmaps of 10, 15 years. Does that make sense? Or do you see the value of this? Or is it just visuals or optics?
I think 10 years matters if you can give a compass bearing of, who are we? What are we about? What do we think is going to stay the same? What do we think is going to change? I think it's important to have that view. To assume that you can create a detailed roadmap for 10 years, 5 years even seems unrealistic to me. Even 3 years seems, borderline unrealistic. The further out you go, the more clear you need to be on what is the light you're following, what is the flag bearing direction that you want to go. And then the closer you get to today, the more specific you need to get on how you want to get there. So it depends what we mean by a 5-year roadmap. If the 5-year roadmap has a detailed investment plan of which technology to enable when, I'd definitely be open to that being a version 0.1 of that and change and adopt as you're going along. But the danger is if you've got very prescriptive details on the how, but not good clarity on why and where, when you make those pragmatic changes, they may be in the wrong direction. So that's where I think the long-term view needs to be super clear, but not prescriptive on how. And then as you work your way closer to today, you need to figure out how, and then also the priorities of the how. What are you going to do first? What are you going to do next? If you have to skip one meeting, which meeting matters more than the other? That should be clear to the whole organization, not just the executives, but cascaded through the different layers and inform the day-to-day decisions.
And that future-proofing concept. So Stefan said it more nicer than generally how we have said it in the past, but we've often called out future-proofing as just total BS. And people selling some future-proofed solution it's more of, can we become more resilient? But you can never future-proof anything. So you said that really, really eloquently. And a better way to think about it with the distribution of outcomes, understanding the potential scenarios and what you become more resilient when you such a narrow potential outcomes into something that's a little bit more understood. And then you become more resilient, but you certainly can never future-proof anything. So I thought that was and look at things probabilistically, like Stefan mentioned the distributions. In other words, you're looking at multiple potential scenarios, and that helps you understand the error bars of where your enterprise might go, and you become a little bit more resilient if you plan against those.
But it is a balancing act, right? Because I'll definitely pound the table for not being short-sighted. Think ahead, think what's next, and plan it. But reality, if you go too far, you may end up working on something for 3 years that's no longer relevant when you're done. And in the meantime, all these business opportunities just flew by and you never grabbed them. So there needs to be a balancing act between finding, maybe there is something tactical that just popped up that we never knew about when we did the 1 year, 3 year, 5 year plan. We should have a mechanism, a model to make decisions around, okay, do we pursue that? Or is it a squirrel that's going to distract us from where we need to get going? There's never going to be a simple answer to that. There needs to be a culture and a governance process to make those decisions. Otherwise, you end up in one extreme or the other. Tactical quick wins that slowly ground you to a halt with tech debt and other issues, dead ends, Or the other extreme is you work on this perfect architecture roadmap, and 3 to 5 years have gone by, and all these other business opportunities are just, you miss them, and whatever you're working on is probably outdated by the time it gets deployed.
Exactly. The future proofing could actually be the future proofing could actually be what traps you in the car when you fall into the lake. You can't actually get out because you future proofed your seatbelt on, and the irony is the future proofing could be actually your downfall.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool point that I totally agree with, which is that how roadmaps and architectures are always evolving. It's not set in stone, and now we'll take a look at it in a year or 2 years from now. And that's why you need people to always look at it, but actually understand the inputs that's coming to your enterprise, so that architecture evolves depending on that. I agree.
Anything you want to tackle? Anything specific you might want to say?
One comment I have is like, some people get disappointed by AI. They get this is a personal hype curve you go through when you try Gen AI. It's like, oh, it can write a poem about my thesis and whatever. And then you try to actually solve a business problem with it, and they can't really figure out what your document is about or whatnot. And then some people become skeptical. And I think the problem with it is that the line of feasibility for AI is so jagged and it's moving all the time. So you may have this point where, like, oh, it's super amazing here, but then I can't do this one basic thing. And to navigate that, it's back to the T-shaped approach. You have to just use it, and you'll just realize, oh, it's really good at doing this. If I want to do this, it's going to be much more work on me, whether it's prompt engineering or training, tuning, that kind of stuff. But I think that's another motivator for getting in there, get your hands dirty, because otherwise you won't get a good sense for kind of what's super easy, what's hard, which will then influence maybe how you feel about it or how much value you get out of it.
It's the horizontal, so you're activating the horizontal.
Yeah.
And Gen AI in general right now, like with scaling, with optimization, etc., they're finding out more capabilities to it. But I agree, in certain areas it lacks, and the idea is like for each person to understand these weaknesses and strengths. Like it can do sentiment, it can do theory of mind and understanding how someone feels from the language. But it can hallucinate also. It actually maintains memory very close to how a human being does. We don't memorize everything 100%. We just keep memories of it. And it's pretty close in its own way. So the understanding of people to get to a point where they understand these shortcomings of Gen AI, I think it will help them find the feasibility much easier.
Yeah, exactly. And some of the shortcomings keep changing as well. So you do have to kind of keep a finger on the pulse. And some of the shortcomings may just be a shortcoming if you try it one direction, but you learn how to solve the problem through a different direction. You also start evening out those jagged lines a little bit because you know how to work around the weaknesses. Maybe it needs some additional prompting, maybe it needs some additional tuning or whatnot to get the outcome that you want. Maybe it needs more context, less context, etc. And again, it goes back to the horizontal of let people play with it and use it, because then they'll find out how to not necessarily work around the weaknesses, but address the weaknesses head on by using the tool in different ways, different prompting, different tuning, different expectations of what it's going to produce for you.
I was going to mention, Ryan keeps repeating that understanding the benefits of the whole field of AI is very important, just because maybe Gen AI is not the solution, but AI is. You still have a lot of machine learning, a lot of practices on the data science side, classics that can solve a lot of your problems before jumping into Gen AI, even if it does it.
I think that's another soapbox speech I have, is there's pretty much no business problem that can be solved with one AI solution. And that's why it's so important to start with not the solution, what can it solve for me, but what do I want to get solved. And you may find, oh, I'm going to put 2 AI agents and some automation. I need 3 new APIs, some more data. And by the way, I need to train these 5 users differently. Only when all of those checkboxes are actually checked would you actually achieve the outcome. I think many still look for like the one-to-one mapping between business problem and AI solution. And I don't think they exist.
That's AGI at some point, I guess.
Maybe next year.
Well, I really enjoyed the conversation, Stefan. Thank you so much for joining us.
This was fun. Thank you. I'm excited to see how this turns out.
Yep. Thanks for your time, Stefan.
Farabi Innovations.